I'd like a few moments to discuss the Vietnam situation with you. Because for too long, I've watched this sorry Vietnam War and have remained silent. So I'm making this record to register my personal protest to my government. It is my sincere hope that these words may inspire others to join me. If all of us who are against this Vietnam War will only speak out, it will bring meaningful influence to bear upon our president. One of the real tragedies of the Vietnam War is that most of our respected and influential citizens have remained silent as our involvement in Vietnam has assumed major proportions. The leaders of American business, the articulate senators and representatives of both parties, the strong and powerful labor chiefs, the respected members of our educational and religious institutions, the mayors, state legislators and governors, leaders of the medical and legal professions. These are really the only people whose publicly stated views can change our government policy. Their relative silence and their reluctance to become involved has encouraged the administration to continue its present Vietnam War policy. We parents, we veterans of World Wars I and II, we're the ones who should be making our anti-Vietnam War sentiment known to our government. We have, by default, allowed the war protest to be led almost exclusively by our children, by our silence, by our indifference, and by our refusal to become involved. We have made it appear as if the only ones protesting the war are our long-haired, bearded sons and mini-skirted daughters on the American college campuses. These and the Communist Front organizations. But there are, in addition to the noisy campus demonstrators, millions of loyal, sincere, mature Americans who strongly disagree with our involvement in Vietnam and who take exception to President Johnson's remarks of November 10, 1967, when he said, "All that we have as a nation we owe to the unity of our people. All that we work for now, the worth of all of our dreams and sacrifice hangs on how much unity we bring to the battleground, where our beliefs and our future are at test." The president continued regarding our soldiers in Vietnam and said, quote, "For these Americans, Vietnam is no academic question. It's not a topic of cocktail parties, office arguments, or debate from the comfort of some distant sidelines. These Americans in Vietnam do not live on the sidelines. Their lives are tied by flesh and blood to Vietnam. Talk does not come cheap for them. The cost of duty is too cruel. The price of patriotism comes too high." The president continued and said, and I quote, "You and I know that it is harder and tougher to ask for and achieve a limited victory. One could surrender or start World War III and do either without much help." End of President Johnson's quote. Well, if our president is saying that those of us who disagree with our involvement in Vietnam must be silent, that we must accept the leadership and the philosophy of this administration, his concept of democracy leaves no room for our precious right to dissent. He forgets that after World War II, we Americans argued that if of Hitler and his policies, they should have rebelled against his government. However, we now understand that subject to the Nazi propaganda machine and its repressive power, most Germans condoned, approved, or at the very least kept silent in their criticism of the leadership of the Nazi government. Now, it would be wrong for anyone to accuse our government of practicing Nazi methods. I must make this point crystal clear so that I am not misunderstood. The very fact that my words may be recorded and said publicly indicates that technically and legally we do have the right to dissent in this country. Unfortunately, the practical value of this right to dissent is eroded because what the dissenters have to say is definitely inside page news, editorial comment, or to be found in the letters to the editors columns, which unfortunately few Americans read. This contrasted with the pronouncements of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet members, which are headline front page news. The real power of the American press, radio, and television is completely in the hands of the administration. The administration point of view, like the cigarette, mouthwash, hairspray, and deodorant commercials, completely saturate our radio and television listening time. Those in dissent are barely audible. It is indeed unfortunate that the only form of dissent which does make the front pages and is dramatically covered by television and radio is that sorry sight of our younger generation demonstrating. The picture that these young anti-war leaders project is distasteful. The inference is that if one doesn't wear a beard, if he doesn't need a haircut, or if he's over 25, that he approves of the Vietnam War. Mr. Average American, the real backbone of this country, rarely makes the headlines, no matter what his views on any issue. And yet, despite our collective silence, the Vietnam War has become increasingly unpopular. The most recent Gallup poll estimates that 20 million Americans, more than 1 out of every 6 adults who once approved of this war, have now come to consider it a mistake. During the past 2 years, a total of 46 million Americans, or 41% of the adult population, now disapprove of this war. The most recent Harris poll indicated that public confidence in President Johnson and in his handling of the Vietnam War has dropped to a new low of 23%. This poll was published in the New York Times on November 14, 1967. And in this same Harris poll taken in late October 1967, the number of those expressing support of Mr. Johnson's determination to fight until a negotiated peace was only 26%. It had dropped from 51% in July. The number of those favoring a withdrawal from Vietnam as quickly as possible increased from 24% in July to 44% in late October 1967. And the number of those who wanted total victory stood at a new low of only 21%. Now, this growing disapproval of the war is even more significant when one considers that all of the top brass of the administration, including the president, vice president, and cabinet members and others, have been given the national publicity spotlight in which to express their views. Thus, despite all the power and exposure of the administration's pro-war propaganda, the American antipathy of this war has reached serious and major proportions. The administration was able to sell this war to the country because it has protected our comfortable way of life here at home. We were all told that we could enjoy both guns and butter. However, if we were forced to pay the $35 billion per year that it is currently costing to fight this war, the 70 million workers in this country would pay on the average of $500 per man per year to support this undeclared war. How many then in our country would actually vote to spend between $200 and $2,500, depending on their income bracket, to wage this war? The cost of Vietnam is so gigantic that no one figures he's really paying for anything. But any program which costs this country $35 billion a year, which amounts to the staggering figure of $673 million every week, or $96 million every day, including Sundays, or almost $4 million each hour of every 24-hour day, 7 days a week. This is a subject that must somehow find its way to the public ballot box. Our government is waging a war. Our soldiers in Vietnam are fighting a war. But we here at home are living better than ever before. And if we were not, we would soon make our protest heard and felt in Washington. Isn't it preposterous that our boys, our sons, are fighting and dying in Vietnam, while here at home, the UAW negotiated its best labor contract, and American business has enjoyed another record boom year? Many of us earnestly believe that we have embarked upon a fool's course in Vietnam. We feel that our experience there proves that we stand virtually alone in our crusade to determine the form of government which any country shall adopt. We must convince ourselves that the world of the future will be one where communism or some other ism, as yet unborn, will share this world with what we now call Western democracy. Our most pressing problem is to recognize that the United States of America cannot alone hold back the tide of communism. Beyond that, our action in Vietnam is in fact inconsistent with our policies toward aggression in times past. Historical facts clearly show that many times we've closed our eyes to aggression when it has suited our convenience or when it has meant an honest showdown with Russia. Allow me to recall some recent history. First, we allowed Russia to emasculate Hungary. The cries of the Hungarian freedom fighters fell on deaf American ears. Second, we allowed Russia to wall off the city of Berlin, despite the fact that by treaty agreement with Russia after World War II, there was to be no division of East and West Berlin. Third, we forced Russia to remove the missile bases from Cuba, but we did not neutralize or stop communism in Cuba. We were afraid to blockade Cuba. We did not defend or protect those who wanted democracy in Cuba. Rather did we allow Castro to ship out to the USA those Cubans who preferred democracy to communism. Why did we allow Castro to forcibly take over Cuba, which is only 90 miles from our shores, and then go to war to prevent a communist takeover 12,000 miles away in Vietnam? Fourth, we turned a deaf ear to Israel on 2 occasions, once in 1956 and again in 1967, when Nasser openly threatened to wipe Israel off the map. In 1956, we ruptured our alliance with France and England when we refused to help them or even approve of their solution to the Suez problem. And in this year of 1967, despite the announced threat of Nasser to, quote, drive the Israelis into the sea, end of quote, and to annihilate this tiny country, we stood by on the sidelines, transfixed as a hypnotized crowd watches a bully prepare to rape a defenseless girl. Fortunately, Nasser was an inept tactician, and the Israelis beat him to the punch. Our past Mideast record indicates we probably would have watched offshore as Nasser flushed the Israelis down the drain. The record is clear then. Our involvement in Vietnam is really contrary to our usual policy. We have used the SEATO Treaty as our moral commitment to defend and protect Vietnam. I think it is obvious that if Russia or Red China had attacked Vietnam, we would have found some valid reasons why we should not be there. We thought we could bluff our way through Vietnam and stop Ho Chi Minh. We now find ourselves, instead, mired in the Vietnamese quicksand, with no major ally in the Western world giving active military support to our effort. We are foolishly and recklessly supplying most of the men and all of the money. We are receiving only token help from the 30 million Filipinos whose country would be on the front lines if the communists won in Southeast Asia. There is not one Philippine combat unit in Vietnam. Their help has been limited to several construction and medical battalions. Australia and New Zealand, who stand to lose the most if the domino theory is correct, are making no all-out war effort. The nationalist Chinese from Taiwan have not been allowed to join us because we fear Red Chinese retaliation. No Japanese fighting forces are joining us in our effort to stem communism. Our main outside ally in Vietnam is South Korea, and we are paying for every cent of their effort. Thailand only recently agreed to raise their troop contribution from a token 2,000 to 20,000 men. And it goes without saying that the French, Dutch, English, Greek, Norwegian, Swedish, Turk, Belgian, Indian, Spanish, German, Canadian, South American, Irish, Scotch, and Italian manpower are busy watching us rather than helping us. We fight a war to contain the tide of communism, while Japan, New Zealand, Australia, England, Canada, and France, and others are shipping and selling vast quantities of goods to Red China. Some of these countries even continue to trade directly with North Vietnam, and yet they are permitted at the same time to enjoy profitable trade with the U.S. and South Vietnam. There is something very wrong and very sick with this kind of reasoning. We must, as a nation, realize that we are fighting a hypocritical, no-win war in Vietnam because we are afraid to win. We're afraid to bomb Haiphong and Hanoi because we fear Russian and Chinese intervention in Vietnam or retaliation elsewhere. We have forgotten that you just can't be a little pregnant. In a war, you either fight to win, or there is really no point in fighting at all.